My name is Nadia Reeves, and I was 26 years old when my stepmother handed me a check for $400 and told me to be out of my father's house by the end of the month. $400. I want you to sit with that number for a moment because I think it deserves a moment. My father, Gerald Reeves, had spent 30 years building his estate. 30 years of a logistics business he had started with $12,000 and a borrowed van, and that he had grown through consistent, unglamorous work into something worth significantly more than $400. He had bought the house I grew up in when I was 4, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street with a study at the back that he used every evening after dinner to review his accounts and make his plans and do the careful, organized work of a man who understood that what he built was only as secure as the attention he paid to it. My father died of a cardiac event in March when I was 26. Sudden, no warning. The kind of loss that does not give you time to prepare or ask the questions you should have asked or understand the full picture of what is being left behind and to whom. Linda had been my stepmother for 3 years. She had moved in when I was 23 and had been warm and present and organized in the way that people are warm and present and organized when they are establishing a position. She had managed my father's calendar and his appointments and had been, he told me once, the most practically useful person he had ever lived with. He said it with affection. She organized the funeral with impressive efficiency. She retained an estate attorney the following week. She presented me with a settlement offer the week after that. A single check, $400. She said, "This represents your share of the liquid assets after costs." She said it with the same efficient warmth she brought to everything, the warmth of a woman who has already made all the decisions and is now informing you of them. I took the check. I did not cash it. I moved into a studio apartment with 2 bags and a box of my father's photographs and the specific hollow grief of a person who has lost a parent and discovered in the same month that the people around that parent had been making plans she was not part of. Before I tell you what Roy found under the floor 14 months later, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I love knowing where you are when you listen to this. Now, let me tell you about the box. I want to tell you about the 14 months between the check and the phone call, because those months matter, and because the story of what happened under the floor only makes full sense if you understand what I was doing while the floor was still intact. I was not doing nothing. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this story that is most satisfying presents me as someone who immediately knew what to do and did it, and the true version is more complicated and more useful. I consulted an estate attorney in the second month, a woman named Grace, who had the efficient, unsentimental manner of someone who has seen many versions of this situation and has opinions about all of them. She reviewed the settlement and told me that the $400 figure was almost certainly not a legitimate representation of my share of the estate, but that contesting it would require documentation I did not currently have, and that documentation was the center of everything. She said, "Nadia, do you know what your father owned?" I knew some of it: the house, the business, which Linda had sold 3 months after the funeral to a competitor for a price I had not been told and could not verify, a car, some savings accounts I had been told were depleted by medical and funeral costs. She said, "Do you have documentation of any of this independently?" I said, "No." She said, "That is the problem. Without independent documentation of what the estate contained and what it was worth at the time of my father's death, contesting the settlement was going to be an expensive and uncertain process." Grace told me to gather everything I could from any source available: bank statements, business records, property records, anything with my father's name on it that predated Linda's management of his affairs. I gathered what I could. It was not enough. My father had been organized in his own systems, and Linda had been organized in reorganizing those systems after his death, and what I had access to was not a complete picture. I was in this incomplete place, 14 months in, when my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, and the name on the screen was Roy Denton. Roy had worked for my father for 11 years. He was a general contractor my father had used for every project on the house, and several projects for the business. He was the kind of man my father trusted completely, because he was the kind of man who did what he said he would do, and charged what he said he would charge, and had never, in 11 years, given my father a reason to question either of those things. I answered. He said, "Nadia." I said, "Roy." He said, "I am at your father's house." He said, "Linda hired us to do the floors, new hardwood throughout." He said, "My crew pulled up the study floor this afternoon." He paused. I said, "What did you find?" He said, "There is a box, Nadia, fireproof, built into the subfloor. Looks like it's been there since the original installation." He said, "Your name is on it, on the outside, your father's handwriting." I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the wall in front of me, and I thought about my father in his study every evening after dinner, doing his careful, organized work, and I understood something I had not understood before. He had known, not the specific details, the shape of it, and he had done something about it in the only way available to him. I said, "Roy, do not let anyone open that box." He said, "I figured." He said, "How fast can you get here?" I drove to the house in 40 minutes. The house I had grown up in, the house I had been told to leave with a $400 check 14 months ago. I pulled into the driveway, and the front of it was exactly the same as I remembered and completely different in the way that places are different when they belong to someone else, and the someone else has made small changes that add up to a different atmosphere, even when nothing dramatic has changed. New curtains in the front window, a different mat at the door, a potted plant on the left side of the porch that had not been there before. Small things, Linda's things, the specific marking of territory that people do when they want a place to feel like it has always been theirs. Roy met me at the door. He was a big, quiet man who had always communicated primarily through the quality of his work rather than the quantity of his words, and today was no different. He said, "It is in the study." He stepped back and let me in. I walked through my father's house, past the hallway where his coat had hung, past the kitchen where he had made coffee every morning at 6:15 for as long as I could remember, past the living room where Linda had replaced his furniture with something more modern and more hers, into the study at the back. A long pause. The floor was half up. Roy's crew had pulled the hardwood from most of the room, and the subfloor was exposed, and in the corner near the window where my father had kept his desk, there was a rectangular cutout in the subfloor, and in the cutout was a fireproof document box, approximately the size of a shoebox, painted dark gray with a combination lock on the front, and my name written on the top in my father's handwriting. Nadia. Just that. His handwriting, the specific way he made the N, which I had seen on birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter, and the edges of documents he had wanted me to look at. His handwriting, on a box under his floor. Roy said nobody has touched it. His crew was outside. It was just me and Roy and the box and the study where my father had done his careful, organized work every evening after dinner for 30 years. An emotional pause. I sat on the exposed subfloor next to the box. I looked at it for a moment. Then I said, "Roy, did my father ever talk to you about this?" Roy said, "Not directly." He said, "I installed that subfloor 12 years ago." He said, "Your father supervised every part of the installation personally." He said, "There was a section he asked me to leave accessible. He told me it was for storage." He said, "I did not ask more than that because it was not my business to ask more than that." I said, "Do you know the combination?" Roy said, "No." He said, "But he gave me something when we finished the installation." He reached into his jacket pocket and he handed me a folded piece of paper. On it, in my father's handwriting, were 6 digits, and a note, 4 words, for when you need it. I opened the box with the 6 digits Roy handed me, and the combination worked on the first try, because my father had been a man who did things correctly the first time and expected the things he built to function as intended. Inside the box was a folder. Inside the folder was a document. I want to be precise about what it was, because precision is what matters here, and vagueness would not honor what my father had done. It was a handwritten amendment to his estate documents, signed, dated, and witnessed by 2 signatures I recognized, Roy Denton and a woman named Harriet Moss, who had been my father's bookkeeper for 20 years, dated 14 months before his death, witnessed formally, notarized by a notary stamp I could verify. The amendment specified that the house was to be held in trust for me and transferred to my name upon his death, that the business was to be valued independently before any sale, and that I was entitled to 40% of the sale proceeds, that the settlement offer presented to me by the estate, the $400 check, had no legal standing, as it contradicted the terms of this amendment, which superseded all prior estate documents. $400 for a house and 40% of a business, presented to a grieving 26-year-old by a woman who had apparently searched everywhere for this document and had not found it because she had not known to look under the floor. I called Grace from the driveway. I told her what I had found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Nadia, do not let that box out of your sight." I said, "I have it." She said, "I need you to photograph every page immediately and send it to me before you leave that property." I photographed every page. I sent them. Grace called back in 20 minutes. She said, "This is valid." She said, "Nadia, this changes everything." I stood in the driveway of my father's house, holding a fireproof box he had installed 12 years ago for a moment that had arrived 14 months after he died, and I thought about him supervising every part of that installation personally, about the note, for when you need it. He had known. He had known the shape of what might happen, and he had built something that could not be accessed without the combination, and could not be found without knowing where to look, and could not be destroyed because it was fireproof, and could not be dismissed because it was witnessed and notarized, and completely, carefully, deliberately valid. I took a deep breath. Linda called while I was still in the driveway. Her name appeared on my screen, and I looked at it for a moment, and then I answered because I was done avoiding difficult conversations, and because I had a fireproof box in my hand, and a document Grace had already confirmed was valid, and because the shape of what came next was completely clear. She said, "Nadia, Roy told me you came to the house." I said, "Yes." She said, "I need to talk to you about the renovation." I said, "I think there are more important things to talk about, Linda." I said, "I found the box." The silence on the other end of the call was 6 seconds long. I counted. Then she said, "What box?" I said, "The one under the study floor, the one with my name on it, the one my father installed 12 years ago." She said nothing. I said, "My attorney will be in touch." I hung up. The legal process took 7 months. I want to be honest about that, because stories that resolve in a single dramatic moment are not honest, and I would rather be honest than satisfying. 7 months of documentation and filings, and a mediation session, and a final settlement that was nothing like $400, and everything like what my father had intended. The house transferred to my name. The business sale proceeds, which Grace's investigation established had been significantly higher than Linda had disclosed, were partially recovered. The final settlement included the house, a substantial financial payment, and a formal legal acknowledgement that the original $400 settlement had been presented without full disclosure of the estate's assets. Linda did not contest it. I think she understood that contesting it would require her to explain in a courtroom why she had presented a $400 settlement to her stepdaughter while knowing that a handwritten amendment existed somewhere in the house she had just inherited. She may not have known exactly where, but Grace established in the process that she had known it existed, that my father had told her it existed, that she had searched for it and not found it, and had decided to proceed with the settlement anyway and hope that it never surfaced. She had renovated the floor. Her own renovation had found the thing she had been hoping would stay hidden. Roy Denton testified in the mediation. He was brief and precise and said exactly what had happened and nothing more than what had happened because that is the kind of man he was. He said my father had asked him to install the compartment. He said my father had supervised every detail. He said my father had given him the combination on a piece of paper and asked him to hold it and give it to me if it was ever needed. I had not known Roy was holding it. My father had not told me, because telling me would have required telling me why, and telling me why would have required acknowledging something he hoped would not be necessary. And my father was an optimist in the specific way of men who prepare carefully for the worst and hope it does not arrive. I moved back into the house in the fall. The study floor was repaired by Roy's crew at Linda's expense as part of the settlement terms. I kept the subfloor compartment. Roy offered to seal it permanently, and I said no. I said, leave it accessible. He understood without my explaining why. I sit in the study some evenings. Not every evening, but some. I sit at the desk my father sat at, and I look at the corner of the room where the floor had been pulled up and where a box with my name on it had been waiting for 14 months for someone to renovate the right room. My father was a man who built things carefully, who paid attention to what he built and maintained what he built, and understood that the things worth protecting required more than a locked door and a good intention. He built a compartment under a floor and put a combination on it and wrote my name on the outside and left a note that said, for when you need it. I needed it. He knew I would, and he made sure it was there. That is what this story is about. Not Linda and not the settlement and not the 7 months of legal process. It is about a father who loved his daughter clearly enough to plan for the moment when that love needed to be more than a feeling, when it needed to be a document, under a floor with her name on it. If your father or your grandmother or someone who loved you left something behind that you have not yet found, keep looking. It may be under a floor you have not pulled up yet. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.